Oh, I'm recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9. So, I just want to remind you all of my office hours every weekday morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., Monday through Friday, for an hour. So, please contact me if you have any questions about anything. I got my computer on a shelf here, so you can't quite see me, not that you want to. So, the first slide that you're looking at here is a map that I put together. I hope you like the fiery clip art to give you a global view of where we are and where we're going. So, the center of the world is shifting in the period that we're covering in class right now. It's shifting from the Middle East and Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. And we call this the Atlantic world. So I want to focus a good amount of time over the next few weeks on those areas that were peripheral. How did they adapt? What were the effects of globalization on these people? What lessons might their histories have for people dealing with global changes today? We live in a country that was the global superpower when all of you were born. Will it still be when you die? Who knows? Whether the answer is yes or no, will it problematically affect your life? I don't think it has to, and am of course optimistic that globalization and a multipolar world can be good things, but that's not always how things have turned out historically. So let's start with a discussion of India. Oh, where are So let's start with India. There have been many periods in world history when India has been amazing. That's where we started this course, was where the Indian Ocean system was one of peace and incredible prosperity. And we're going to be dealing with a period of amazing Indian prosperity and tolerance right now as well. But I love to juxtapose that to the reality of India today, where an extremely intolerant nationalist government has taken control, and hopefully, you know, uh, through historical hindsight, Indians can realize that it doesn't have to be the way it is right now in the year 2020. So, last week I briefly talked about Tamerlane and mentioned that he was a murderous, destabilizing nut job. A century after his terror, another leader arose from the same destabilized region of Central Asia that Tamerlane came from. His name was Babur. Your reading for this week is kind of funny. It depicts Babur as a cannabis loving nut job, which is rather accurate, who, like his ancestor Tamerlane, or even farther back, his ancestor Genghis Khan, wanted to have an empire. Babur was able to establish himself in the Fergana Valley region, which is modern day Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Um, and he wasn't able to, so he went south, eventually conquering the city of Delhi. Not our Delhi, but the other one. Um, and he thereby established the Mughal Empire. Mughal was an early modern Hindi way to say Mongol. Sometimes it's pronounced Mogul as well. You'll hear that. Like, so a great Mogul, someone who's really good at business, comes from the name for the Mughal Empire. So, um, the fact that they wanted to call themselves Mongols just shows the long shadow of the Mongol Empire that continued to spread across Eurasia, just like the long shadow of the Roman Empire that we started this class with. We still have a prominent church called the Roman Catholic Church today. So, um, okay, so Mughal. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. Okay, so Constantinople, which traces itself to the Okay, so Constantinople, which traced itself to the Eastern Roman Empire, fell just decades before the establishment of the Mughal Empire. Babur, however, never really liked India and always saw Persia and broader Central Asia as his area of interest. So, at the same time that the Reformation was just starting in Europe and the age of exploration was beginning to reroute global trade routes, the Indian subcontinent underwent some significant religious changes, and to their credit, avoided the kind of conflict that was so prevalent in West and Central Europe at the same time. One person who was influential in this period was Nanak, who went by the title Guru, or spiritual leader. He grew up in the Punjab region of the Indus Valley, where he lived along the crossroads of Islam and Hinduism in a world where Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jewish people were also prevalent. For much of his early life, he went on pilgrimages to Hindu sites, even to Mecca. As a contemporary of Martin Luther, he had some similarities in his religious outlook on life too, like seeking a simpler, more direct connection with the divine, while disavowing excessive ritual as something that made that connection more difficult and fuzzier. We will come back to Guru Nanak, but I want to segue a bit into the religious traditions of India first. We've talked a lot about the Indian Ocean world system in this class, but less about the peninsula smack in the middle of it, India. So, India has been fascinating for millennia for the coexistence of both diversity and a sense of unity among people who live there. So, I should clarify that for most of the last 3,000 years, the subcontinent has rarely been united politically, and there's been incredible linguistic diversity there too. But one unifying force has often been religion, even though religion's generally been quite diverse too. So in India, you've got the first emergence of universalizing religions, those that basically taught human beings had an obligation to behave ethically towards all, because we all have got a relationship with divine powers that's universal. The ancient Veda scriptures were carried to India between 4 and 3,000 years ago, and those scriptures have been considered holy by Zoroastrians, who still have a small presence in India today, Buddhists, and later Hindus. Zoroastrianism, with its core area in Persia, and Jains and Sikhs, are also recognize the divinity of these scriptures. Um, But Zoroastrianism, with its core area in Persia, was dominant in much of Central Asia and northern India until the spread of Buddhism and Christianity. So, an ancient religious thinker from India, who in the 6th century before the Common Era shared some similarities with Nanak, was Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, whose simple message of needing to overcome natural urges through seeking enlightenment proved powerfully inspiring. Buddhism spread across India after the 3rd century before the Common Era, when the leader of the Mauryan dynasty, Ashoka the Great, renounced war and dedicated himself to the propagation of Buddhism. Buddhism was really the first religious movement to unite India, though it was always at odds with the Brahmins, or religious order of the old Vedic traditions. What's interesting about India is that by the 5th century of the Common Era, much of the subcontinent developed Hinduism, often as a syncretic fusion of local pre Buddhist traditions with newer ideas that didn't necessarily renounce Buddhist ideals. So the incredible richness of Hinduism drew on the Vedas and many later teachings of later religious leaders and thinkers. And there were also, throughout this period, small Christian communities that continued to exist in some parts of the subcontinent as well. So by the 7th century, Islam spread to the northern parts of India, and India today has the second highest number of Muslims of any country on earth. And unfortunately, they're being incredibly discriminated against under the Modi regime that I keep knocking. Um, so, the Mauryan dynasty of Ashoka was the closest to a political union of all India before the Mughals came, um, even closer after the 1500s. But I've emphasized religion because even though there's a huge diversity of languages, religion often transcended the divisions while retaining really incredibly interesting local flares. So I went into this slightly lengthy background to emphasize that this was the diverse world that Nanak lived in. So let me try and change slides. I always have trouble changing slides. Come on. So as the Mughal Empire was establishing itself, there was lingering tension in India with the remnants of Tamerlane's Islamic Empire to the north and newly established Safavids in Persia bringing refugees with new ideas into India. So even though local Muslims at the time were relatively peacefully living with their Hindu neighbors, this influx of new people created tension. Nanak's teachings at this time were incredibly helpful and calming. Sikhism, as it emerged, was for Nanak a new revelation from on high that argued Islam and Hinduism were just mechanisms to get to deity, not institutions with absolute say on religious matters. Sikhs to this day emphasize that theirs is a new revelation, but many non Sikhs like to see it as a synthesis of Islam and Hinduism. One of the requirements is for men to wear a turban. Your book outlines the 5 Ks, which militaries of the world will often accommodate. I love this picture. I believe it's from 2010 of U.S. Army soldiers. The camera is clearly trying to get the Sikh in the picture to show that the army had just recently allowed for a little bit of diversity so that a devout Sikh can still wear a turban and serve his country with pride. But what I love about this picture is it focuses on this guy who's clearly just annoyed to have a camera in his face, and he has no idea that the person behind him is probably the one they're actually trying to take a picture of. So Uh, let's skip ahead. Come on, come on, slides. Let's go. So, a period of prosperity for the Mughals came with their third ruler, Akbar the Great. Akbar is an Arabic name meaning great, and to make sure people got the point, he used a Hindi version too, so you might translate his name as Great the Great. It's useful to contrast the prosperity and religious tolerance of his reign to most kingdoms in Europe at the same time, with maybe the exception of the Ottoman Empire and Poland, Lithuania. Tolerance was a difficult commodity to find in Europe of the 1500s. So, under Akbar, the Mughal Empire spread almost all the way across the subcontinent. Early in his reign, from Delhi, he and I have a hard time saying Delhi instead of Delhi. Um, he was not in charge here in Delhi, New York. We uh, did not exist as a incorporated village at that point. So So early in his reign from Delhi, he allied himself with Muslims and Hindu Rajputs, as and he married a Rajput princess to show tolerance and the oneness of all Indians. There are dozens of great Bollywood movies about this marriage that commemorate, his union. Here's an advertisement for one of them. You can get some of them on Netflix now too. So Akbar was actually fascinated by religion. Urganic reading makes fun of him, which annoys me a bit because I so obviously admire him. His movement, Sul el Kul, was about embracing tolerance and the light that all religions have. Through giving local rulers a stake in the empire based on his acceptance of diversity, Akbar was able to control trade, collect taxes, even with the worrisome Portuguese along his borders. He had one of his kids convert to Roman Catholicism just to be able to better understand the Portuguese. But I don't want to over romanticize India. Uh, so, because unfortunately, this common sense approach to diversity didn't last forever. And as I mentioned earlier, it is no longer the case in India today either, despite the cultivation of strong democratic traditions over the last century. Akbar's grandson, or great grandson, Shah Jahan, began to favor Muslims over Hindus, and his successor, Aurangzeb, openly committed genocide against Hindus. Aurangzeb saw Rajput rebellions as Hindu inspired, and in one of these conflicts, the last of the gurus of the Sikhs, Tegh Bahadur, sacrificed himself as he pled for the lives of Hindus who were about to be massacred. By the early 1700s, then, the Mughal Empire was in shambles, and it had crumbled because of hatred and divisiveness from within. Diversity had been its strength, and intolerance was its downfall. Over the next century, after the fall of the Mughals, French, British, and Portuguese agents whittled away at the autonomy of the Mughals until all of India became an official British colony by 1858. Under British rule, this formerly prosperous area of the world became one of the most impoverished and backwards places on earth. They've rebounded. India is doing better today than it has in centuries. But again, I keep knocking the intolerance with obvious historical hindsight of the consequences of intolerance. So I suppose this shows that it's ultimately people and their choices that sway the fate of empires, nations, countries, whatever, not institutions or structures. Peace and prosperity are precious and rare, and they're things all of us need to advocate for. So this is my call for you to become involved in politics locally, at the state level, and nationally. Voting is the first step, but being active, learning, understanding, and voicing opinions on issues is so important too. If you are not able to vote in the upcoming election, I hope you will register and be able to vote in the next election. And I do want to have this little deal that I've mentioned before that if you show me evidence that you did vote this time around, I will give you 5 extra credit points on one of your papers. So far, only one person has taken me up on that. And by voting and advocating for what you believe in, understanding why people disagree with you and why they think the way they think, that certainly doesn't hurt either. So, last class, I showed you this map of Africa to emphasize that the Europeans who made it didn't have a clue about anything beyond the coast. And the next map is a repeat of ideas I've shared before, emphasizing the Atlantic slave trade had serious effects on African politics. By 1750, once powerful empires had been replaced by many mafia like states who existed for the sake of slave trading. Northrop, I have two questions about this in your focus questions this week. He tries to downplay the guns for slaves concept by emphasizing African choice and power. Um, he doesn't downplay the fact, though, that the trading network shifted to the coast, making European goods available to people across the continent. That should help you answer the first and fourth focus questions for this week. On this map, one bright spot is the Bornu Kingdom, Kanem and Bornu, right here, which maintained a sense of power as established by Idris Aluma, who we talked about a couple weeks ago. Um, so I want to go back and talk about some things we talked about last time. So two of the kingdoms that we talked about ever so briefly last week that are relevant to this readings again are Benin and Wari. So modern day Benin and parts of Nigeria, that's where these kingdoms were, where Oza Ozaula saw the Portuguese and Christianity as a way to leverage power against the Songhai. Most people, like I've stated in class before, saw through these conversions and retained their traditional religions, with Yoruba traditions being prominent, even among non-Yoruba peoples. So, um, jumping back here. So, Dahomey along the Ashanti and along with Ashanti and Calabar were notorious small kingdoms that would play leading roles in the slave trade. Dahomey emerged in roughly the same area as the previous Benin kingdoms of Ozula, and one of the reasons Northrop focuses on them, despite their small size, is that they played outsized roles in the trafficking of human beings. They didn't sell their own people, and they really didn't even capture people to sell, but they acted as trading points with prime locations along the rivers, with close access to the ocean for others to bring captured human beings. They were very much like the slave traders in the movie about, or very much like the slave traders that Yaroslav worked to fight against that I mentioned earlier in this class. So I want to emphasize that for them to practice this kind of inhumanity meant that they used the same kind of othering strategies that Europeans were using. There's sometimes a discussion that emerges in the United States wondering how they could have sold their own people. The simple answer is that they didn't see them as their own people. The long global struggle against slavery and any other kind of oppression has been based upon seeing everyone as our own people. We all should be just as shocked that Europeans were willing to buy and trade in these people, their own people, as well. So both Dahomey and Ashanti, which is a core area of modern Ghana, built their institutions and wealth on slave trading. These institutions were co opted and really destroyed by later imperialist masters, giving places like Ghana a fresh start after 1957. Ghana, much like India under Akbar, has done a rather remarkable job at building a stable society that accepts the diversity of his people, with occasional exceptions. Um, So the slavery practiced by the Portuguese and Spanish soon spread to other European states. At first through capturing Spanish slave ships, but and again I'm repeating some of the things I said last week. But after New World gold and silver were plundered, the next best way to establish fabulous fortunes was through farming crops like sugarcane, tobacco, indigo, and later cotton. So, over almost 400 years, roughly 15 million people from Africa were transported to the Western Hemisphere. 3 million died in transit, as best we can tell. And African kingdoms, just like the subcontinent of India, were divided and conquered by the power of European wealth that grew rich in the New World from lands stolen from natives and souls stolen from Africa. So, I'd like to hear your thoughts on Northrop's desire, a noble one, to hear African voices in this period. Um, my overall opinion of the book is that African voices that we should be listening to are the victims, but they're largely silent because most sources come from the people who were trading with the Europeans. That, therefore, gives us a dangerously skewed book that comes close to praising the tiny minority of Africans who openly collaborated with Europeans in their policies of terror. So, that's really my problem with his attempt to undermine the guns for slave idea is that the voices he's listening to are the people who were enslaving other people, whether they were Africans or Europeans involved in this dirty trade. And he does later in the book try to give voice to slaves themselves, but I think that perspective would radically undermine his thesis. So, okay, let me switch now to your bonus questions. Ooh, those are small. Can I make that any bigger for you? Um, how does that work? That's 14-point font now. Okay, so I hope you all have a good week and reach out to me if you'd like to talk about anything at all. All right, bye.